had just graduated from the University of Iowa in 1985 when I was exposed to the farm crisis. And I was from upstate New York. I didn't know anything about farmers or the Iowa farm crisis except what I'd read in the newspapers, which we still had back then. And I got involved with Iowa CCI when it was still called Iowa Citizens for Community Improvement, and ended up at a meeting with about 200 farmers. I was in the back with a representative from the Harkin office and from the Grassley office. And these farmers were going to town on these guys. And yeah, as far as I could tell, they were blowing smoke back at them. And people were frustrated. There were stories about beehives getting put in people's mailboxes and their kids finding them when they went to get the mail, and dung getting thrown up on their porches, and people getting chased off their land. Somebody who could pay for the 40 acres around their house, but the bank wouldn't take the money because they wanted the whole farm. And this really changed my life. I stood up and asked a question about how Harkin had taken his name off of the Save the Family Farm Bill, which was the hope for all of us at that time. And I'd heard about it on the radio on the way there. And there was a gasp in the audience when I said it. And all these guys, like 2 feet taller than me, surrounding me, and I'm in the back of the room, and the Harkin guy wouldn't answer it. And the crowd started yelling to him, answer her question, answer that girl's question, because he moved on to somebody else. And he said one of those, I'll have to get back to you on that things. And all of that just changed my whole life. That one experience was, okay, this is how people find their voice. This is how they make change. This is how they hold people accountable. And I was hooked. Between that and the divestiture demonstrations at the campus my last year against South Africa, I was totally hooked on the notion of collective action changing the world. I went to a graduate student from Africa, his name was Ibo, when I was a senior, and said, I want to be a worker, or I want to be a farmer. I want to be these things. And he said, you can't be. And I said, why not? And he said, because you get to choose. And workers and farmers, they don't get to choose. But you have a college education now, and your job, if you want it to be, is to aid them in their work. And so I realized that what we now call privilege was just, to me, being a white college-educated person with a writing degree, I could tell their stories. I could, as best I could, honor their struggles. Of course, I couldn't get a job as a journalist coming out in 1985, where I was living, which was Waterloo, Iowa. But I simply lived the experience. We were living on the east side. We were the only white people for, 20 blocks. But that's what the economics of our situation were, the man I was living with, who I eventually married. And I got to know my neighbors, and I got to know what was going on, because the only way to stay warm was to get into a hot tub of water some January days. And, we didn't have much money, so I'd walk the grocery aisles sometimes almost in tears, because all I could afford was macaroni and cheese and a bag of frozen veggies. And, it gave me a taste. It just gave me a taste of what people go through, a lot of people go through in this country every day. So all of that in my 20s formed me into someone who realized I could dedicate my life to using my skill set to aid and abet the efforts of people who may not know how to come together and organize, or may not know how to tell their story, or simply don't have access to a system that allows them to tell their stories. So I could be that bridge. I could be of service. I could be of use. And I've enjoyed it ever since. I've alternated between organizing and writing my whole life, and for unions, for nonprofits, or just getting out and doing the work on the ground, and struggling with the challenges of coalition work and cross-racial work and cross-class work. It's it's not easy peasy. It's not something that can get funded by a federal grant and be done from 8 to 5. It's something that you do in your spare time because you have to. It's our responsibility, I think. And to me, it's the difference between radical and liberal is that liberals can walk away at any time and just feel good about what they did, but radicals know that they're tied, their futures and their livelihoods are tied to the inextricably to the people being treated the worst among us. And so I got, a union gig as a communications director in Chicago, and there's seldom a happy end to the story in union organizing, especially black workers in Chicago, because service workers are so easily replaced. So until you can sustain that, and with collective action, you can't even dream of a victory. Now, out here in rural Iowa, it's a whole different ballgame, right? We're separated by many acres, miles sometimes. We're separated by town versus farm, city versus rural. We're literally separated by distance. So we might all be white, for example, but there's a vast difference in experience. The people who have many generations here compared to the newbies like me, who will never, ever have the kind of credentials that they have, never have that kind of sway. And yet, in February, we gathered 35 people to go to Miller Meeks's and Grassley's and Ernst's office. They're all in the same building in the Quad Cities, rather conveniently. And I can't tell you the number of people who stood up in the midst of a polite conversation with the staff. We had our signs and all that, but we were being polite. But they stood up there with shaking voices and would say, I don't know how to speak publicly, or I've never done this before, and use their voices literally. And you could tell that it changed them, that there's no going back from that. There is a vested interest in people separating rural from urban. And for example, nobody ever talks about the rural poor. The poor people in this country are black and living in the inner city, right? It's BS. There's all kinds of poor people out here, but they're white and they're hiding. They're living on couches or in the trailer in the back behind the house or something. And so they're much harder to see. And that makes us be able to pretend that they don't exist. And so when people who live in cities can see the truth about what's going on in rural America, I think we start bridging that gap and we start saying, wait a minute, we have more in common than we thought. And we're not, by the way, just a bunch of hicks out here. I remember working for the Press Citizen in Iowa City. I was on the opinion page, and I ran the opinion page, and some workers went out on strike at Maytag. And it was a rough economy. And the newsroom was like, why are these idiots going out on strike? How stupid is that to go out on strike? And I would say, as I often do, people make choices from the choices they have. They are full-grown adults with children or mortgages or car payments. They know exactly what they're doing. So why not just respect that and go out and find out why they went out on strike? What drove them to do that? Well, the same thing here. What drove people to vote for Trump? What drove them to do that? Don't just assume that they're stupid or backwards or idiots or uneducated. Assume that they had a vested interest in voting for a man who made the promises he made, and not for the woman they barely knew, who was a different race, who was from California, who was unfamiliar to them. And of course, add to that whatever they're seeing on Fox News. And we have a perfect storm of this kind of situation. And what we don't need is city people saying, just writing us off. We don't need that. Iowa used to be the first in the nation Democratic caucus, right? And we're familiar with journalists, flying in, telling the story of the restaurateur who hosted that presidential candidate that day, and standing by the hay bale and doing their thing and then leaving. And of course, that's the nature of that beast. But there's no way that they could capture what's going on out here. We even struggle here in Iowa with that, right? I was just on the phone with a campaign manager from a major campaign here in Iowa right now. And it was yesterday. And he said, oh, my candidate cares so much about rural Iowa. We want to get to your rural revival that you're organizing here in eastern Iowa, where our subtitle is, we're not just the space between the cities. Because eastern Iowa is the more populated part of the state and western Iowa is not. And so every candidate thinks that if they do an event in western Iowa and they talk to corn and bean farmers, that they've covered the rural angle. And in eastern Iowa, it's a lot more local food farmers and people like me, because we have more people here we can sell direct to consumer. But they act like rural and farming is all just corn and soybeans and hogs and chickens, and that they've covered that base. And we have to teach them that that's not the case. Well, only journalists that are living in that community, only the people who are from here can make that difference, can separate out those things. Just like with union people, when I was a union organizer, not all unions are building trades. There were service workers and there were Teamsters and there were UAW. And it's like the media treated unions as a monolith, and they treat rural Iowa or rural America as a monolith. And I think only having journalists in those communities living this work and getting our own hands dirty and seeing our people at church or at the baseball game or in the grocery store, what's left of it, or knowing that our grocery store is about to go under because SNAP benefits just got cut and they lost their 10% that they needed from SNAP to stay alive. We're the ones that know those stories better than anyone. Of course, again, I count on my editors to make it relevant to a much bigger audience, but we bring that local voice to it and that local perspective. The struggle itself matters. We know this from Mandela and Gandhi and Parks and King. We know that we have to do this because it's what the future builds itself on. And we have to set this example that there's no one hero. There's no hero coming to save us here. We have to do the work ourselves. Sometimes all you have is hope. And that's the one thing I think we have to hang on to. I don't know. Some days it's harder to find than others. But Barn Raiser gives us that hope. To me, also, Indivisible gives me that hope. The Iowa Farmers Union gives me that hope. I cling to these things and I participate in them actively because I have the time that most people don't have. Being semi-retired and growing perennial crops gives me more time than most farmers. I have some skills and experience. And I'm still young enough to be able to employ those skills and experience. So, and I have the privilege of being able to live off of lifetime savings and Social Security and these kinds of things with my husband. So why wouldn't I? Why couldn't I recognize? And I'm one of the few people really on this earth that has the luxury of getting out there and fighting this fight. A lot of other people, especially older liberals who are actually pretty well off, have been crying the poverty game for so long that they forget that they actually have a hell of a lot more than most people do. And it's not about being poor or frugal. It's about being afraid for the future. It's about not knowing if you're going to have enough money for the nursing home or the long-term care that makes them feel poor. Not the fact that they're actually poor, because they're not. A lot of them are professors, retired professors, or retired healthcare workers from the University of Iowa. And yet they feel this stress and poverty because they don't know if they have a future, a secure future. And I tell them, you're guaranteeing that you won't have a secure future if you don't put your resources into the fight now. So let's just cough it up now. I don't want to see a $25 donation. I want to see 100, 200, 300. I want to see stretch donations if that's all you can do. And I want to see your ass on the line. So you better get out to the rally, and you better get out to the congresswoman's office so that her staff can sneer at us. And you better start knocking doors and texting your friends and doing whatever the hell you can do, because this is the fight now. And this is not about where you're going to be living 20 years from now, because we can pretty much guarantee where that's going to be if we don't stop this crazy right now in its tracks. Then that's where I find my hope, is just to say it like it is, and to try to inspire people in any way I can, whether it's the kick in the butt, or it's the cajoling, or it's the comforting, or it's the collective action. We have to find a way to get people off of these screens and out in the streets, one way or the other. And that is what I love about Indivisible. That is what I love about the Farmers Union. And that is what I love about Barn Raiser, is that we're telling the stories of people who are getting up and moving physically to make something happen. And I think that's a key part, not the only thing, but a key part to whether we're going to stop this march of fascism across our country.